Hello and welcome everyone to this afternoon's online event, Podcasting History. My name is Dr. Andrew Smith and I'm the Director of Liberal Arts at Queen Mary University of London. I'm also a member of the RHS Council and it's my pleasure to be invited along today to welcome so many of you to this afternoon's event. Now, we're really lucky to have two wonderful speakers with us today, and it's my great pleasure to introduce them. We have Dr. Bob Nicholson, who is an Associate Head of the History, Geography and Social Sciences Department at Edge Hill University. He works on the history of 19th century Britain and America, with a particular focus on journalism, popular culture, jokes, transatlantic relations, and the digital humanities. He's written and presented items for BBC Radio 4, Radio 3, History Today, and BBC History Magazine. Most recently, he wrote and presented the podcast documentary series Killing Victoria for BBC Sounds, which came out in 2023, which explored the lives of 7 men who attacked Queen Victoria and reached the top 5 in the UK history charts. The podcast is That Is Not the Assailants. And with him is Dr. Dave Musgrove. Dave is the content director of the HistoryExtra.com website and podcast, and plus its sister print magazines, BBC History Magazine and BBC History Revealed. Dave has worked in history publishing for almost 20 years and has published popular history books on British heritage and the Bayeux Tapestry. He launched the History Extra podcast in 2007 and has worked on it ever since. So I'm delighted to welcome along our two guests. But just before we get started, I'd like to add that there will be a question and answer session at the end of the event, in addition to Bob and Dave's talks. And so you can just put in the chat any questions you have, and we'll get round to those just at the end as well. So thank you very much. A warm welcome to everyone that's joined us. And so without any further ado, over to you, Bob and Dave.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. And firstly, thank you to the RHS for inviting us to do this event. We were really delighted to be asked to do it. So I'll give you a quick overview of what to expect from today, and then we'll jump into it. So I'm here very much as a practicing academic. My day job is very much as a lecturer at Edge Hill University, but I also dabble in writing content and presenting podcasts. Dave, who you'll learn more about over the course of today, is very much working every day in the production of podcasts and other kind of public-facing media. So hopefully you get two different perspectives here, from the kind of the academic who wants to get involved in that world, and the perspective of people who've been working in it for a very long time. So we're conscious that there will be a lot of different people in the session today. There'll be some people I know from Twitter who are actively involved in creating podcasts themselves, and perhaps even more qualified than me to talk about it. There will also be people who are regular consumers of podcasts, but I'm very conscious that there will be some people here today who may have heard about podcasts a little bit, but maybe haven't yet ventured into exploring them, and are just kind of curious to know a little bit more about it. So what we want to do is to make sure this session is accessible to everybody. So apologies if there's some stuff here that seems very obvious at the start, but we can get into real technical detail stuff later as well. So I'm just going to get my screen shared, and then we will jump straight in. Okay. Hopefully you should be able to see our slides now. If not, somebody needs to give me a kind of frantic wave, but I think we're looking good. So, as I said, I think we wanted to start with real basics here of just actually explaining what a podcast is, in case there is somebody here who is unsure. And the first thing to say is that this term has now been around for 20 years. This was the article in The Guardian, supposedly, where the term was first coined. So podcasts as a medium are by no means new, though, of course, in around about, I would say, the last 5 or 6 years, they've really taken off and become, I think, an increasingly important part of the mainstream media landscape. They've also become increasingly hard to define because they now take on so many different formats and so many different sort of platforms. But I would say if you're looking for a really straightforward definition of what is a podcast, I would say that it really has two key qualities. Firstly, it is an audio-focused piece of media. So you might encounter podcasts now that people have videoed and that appear on TikTok or on YouTube, but they are principally an audio-focused product. And secondly, they're on demand. So unlike radio, which is broadcast live, a podcast is something that you can tune into and download whenever you like. And really, those are the only two key defining qualities. It's an audio-focused, on-demand piece of media. Beyond that, it can take on a range of different formats that we'll explore in a bit. But really, that's podcasting can be anything as long as it fills those two criteria. And these podcasts have a long history. I'm going to pass over to Dave at this point to tell us a little bit more about this. And I should say, Dave and I are going to go back and forth all the way through this, so you will not have to hear from any one of us for too long, hopefully, before the other comes in to offer some relief. So I'll pass over to Dave a little bit to talk about the history of history podcasting.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bob, and thank you everybody for joining us, and thanks to the RHS for having me on as well. I'm very pleased to be here. So as Bob was saying, podcasting is in its 20th year now, or maybe a little bit longer even. And that quote from The Guardian is an interesting one, where the phrase was first coined back in 2004, and not long after that. In our time, the already established radio program on Radio 4 became a podcast, and it's been one of the BBC's biggest podcasts ever since. Oh, hang on, I've just done something. Oh, there we go. And then in 2005, Apple Podcasts launched, which became kind of the predominant place for podcasts to be hosted and to be played from, and that kind of really set the scene for podcasting to become a thing. And then in short order, people started making history podcasts, and people started making history podcasts because history really lends itself to the podcast format, because it's clearly very story rich, and podcasting is an ideal format, an environment for the telling of great stories. It's also a great place for people to learn and be educated as well as be entertained, and the educational experience is a key one for podcasting. So Americans principally jumped on podcasting early doors with Hardcore History, which is very well established and now has multi-million listens in 2006, and then in 2007, History of Rome by Mike Duncan, sort of again multi-part long form storytelling. In 2007, as Bob said, I launched the HistoryExtra podcast. I'll come back to that in just a second and give you a little bit more info on that. And then Dan Snow launched History Hit in 2014, and Serial came along in 2014 as well. Now, Serial podcast is not a history podcast. It was a kind of multi-part non-fiction investigative storytelling. But it really sort of landed in public consciousness, I think, and sort of got people aware of the concept of podcasts. And I guess by that point, lots more people had phones which were able to utilize the podcast audio environment. So that kind of, I think, is an important moment in the story of podcasting that really seemed to set things in motion. And then after that, you'll see there's an awful lot of podcasts in the history space were launched in the last few years. COVID was certainly a multiplier for that. Some historians have been tempted onto the platform by podcast businesses and broadcasters, but some have done their own thing. And so we've seen, certainly in the last few years, we've seen an awful lot of podcasts launch. So there is a lot of activity going on in the history podcasting space. Going back to the HistoryExtra podcast, so in 2007, I was the editor of the print magazine, BBC History Magazine at that point. I was interviewing Professor, now Sir Ian Kershaw, with a view to writing a print article for the magazine, and I was going to record the conversation using a little recording tool that was physically stuck on the handle of a landline telephone. I was still using a landline telephone. And I thought, well, that would be an interesting conversation, no doubt, for people who are interested in what he said. So it would be a good adjunct to the written piece. So we put it onto what we described as the HistoryExtra podcast at that point. Quite a few people listened, so we thought, well, that's worth doing again. And we carried on doing it on a monthly basis for a while. Times have changed. We now have a dedicated podcast editor and an assistant within the BBC History Magazine editorial team. And basically all the magazine and website editorial team contribute to recording and editing interviews and other podcasts. So it's a really big part of our operation. We produce 6 episodes a week now, mostly one-to-one interviews with historians, and there's over 2,000 episodes in our back catalogue. So there's a lot there, and in combination with these other history podcasts, there's an awful lot of activity happening. So as I said, most of the things that we do are one-to-one interviews, the simplest form of podcast, but we also have other variants, scripted series, and strands within our weekly output. So there's that's brilliant. Thanks, Bob. So this is probably an absolute moment to talk about the different sorts of history podcasts that exist. The most basic one is the first one, just talking to a microphone, delivering a lecture. That's maybe not the best approach for podcasting. That's quite a one-way sort of conversation. The interview one-to-one, that the meat of the History Extra podcast, and to be honest, a lot of the history podcasts out there, is a really good one, a really simple one, and an easy one to do. Debate and panel chats, a bit like what we're doing here. That's always useful. Scripted series, which Bob's going to talk about a bit more in a minute. Outside broadcaster going out, wandering around a heritage site or historic property, much more difficult to do in terms of getting the sound quality right, much more challenging in terms of logistics. Quizzes, they're always good. And then specific formats, i.e. You're Dead to Me, the popular BBC podcast from Greg Jenner. So where you've got a specific setup and you kind of try and do the same thing week on week with that format. So those are the sorts of things that you might want to think about. Those are the things that people have done with podcasts and history up till now. Obviously, the new things may well develop, but that's kind of what we've identified thus far. Before I hand over to Bob to talk at length about his series, I think there's just important to note here, those different formats, they require different things from you. If you want to take on a role in podcasting, there are significant gradations in time, resource, and expertise that those variants demand. So just talking to a microphone, that is much easier than working out how to do a scripted series. It requires much less of you. So just think, if you are going to do a podcast, just think about that. One thing is absolutely crucial, and we'll talk about this throughout the seminar, is that whatever approach you take, the most important thing, I would argue, is to make sure that the actual quality of the recorded audio that you've got is listenable. So you do not want to have background noise, unexpected bangs, hisses, clicks on the line, squeaky chairs, banging windows, anything like that. You have to find a way to avoid that. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. One thing that you can do to aid that is to get a decent microphone. That's probably the main thing to invest on. You don't have to spend loads on it. 20 quid for a USB microphone will give you decent sound quality. It's really important to remember, and I'll drive this home throughout the seminar, is that podcasting is different to radio and other forms of audio, and that it is a very personal experience. You are piping yourself directly into the ears of your listeners. Quite often, it's a very personal experience, very much one-to-one with the listener. So you need to make sure that they get a listening experience which they can enjoy. Right. I'm going to hand over back to Bob to talk about right at the top end of the production quality of podcasting with his series.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I think one of the beautiful things about podcasts, certainly in their early days, is that it could be incredibly sort of DIY efforts of just one person making them, and that can still very much be the case. The example I'm going to show you now, though, is, as Dave says, kind of at the opposite end of the scale on that, and that this is a podcast that I made with BBC Studios, which is the commercial arm of the BBC. They make content, most of which appears on the BBC platform, but some of which then gets sold to other platforms too, like Audible or Spotify. And I thought, rather than just sort of give you the kind of overview of this, I thought let me start by telling you a story from this podcast, and you can see hopefully where the kind of inspiration from it came from. So it's a story that starts in 1840 in London, and on a hot June day, June the 10th, people were gathering in the parks outside of Buckingham Palace. They were waiting, many of them, outside of the palace gates, hoping that they might at some point get a glimpse of Britain's young queen. Recently married, now pregnant, she regularly went on drives around the parks and streets around the palace, to the point where she'd sort of become one of the sights of London. And so people were waiting, hopeful that she would emerge. Around about 6 o'clock, her and Albert finally appeared, riding in an open-topped and open-sided carriage, flanked by just a few mounted guards. And they drove out of the gates of Buckingham Palace, turned left onto Constitution Hill, a road that runs alongside the palace gardens up towards Hyde Park. And there were lots of people there, riding in the park, walking in the park, some of them waiting to see the royal couple. And they didn't have very many guards. It was a very kind of exposed situation. But by and large, this was a normal thing. They did it almost every day. People cheered, they doffed their caps. Some people ran alongside the carriage, hoping to prolong their encounter. But then, around about halfway along the road, something rather dramatic happened. A young man stepped out from the crowd, drew a pistol from his pocket, and fired. chaos erupted, on the hill. Men were thrown from their horses. People started screaming, wondering what had happened. Victoria and Albert weren't quite sure what had happened. They just heard this loud noise suddenly ringing in their ear. But before they could figure out what was going on, the man pulled a second pistol from his pocket and fired again. Now, I don't think this is too much of a spoiler to say he did not kill Victoria. Like, we kind of know at this point that, that she survives for a very long time afterwards, so this was not a successful assassination attempt. But it was a major national incident. I mean, in the immediate wake of it, Victoria and Albert, happily ride away, and the crowd kind of descend on this young man and almost kind of rip him to pieces. But then, in the days and weeks after, the media, the police, the government, the palace officials, everybody is wondering these kind of series of questions. What on earth had happened there in those brief seconds on Constitution Hill? Why had this guy shot at the Queen? And who was he? And for weeks, journalists are trying to figure this out. And really, those were the questions that drove the podcast that I made. I was really interested in answering those same questions, in following in the footsteps of those people who experienced this at the time. And that was really the kind of setup for Killing Victoria. It was an attempt to look at men like this. This guy's name was Edward Oxford, to try and understand his background, to recreate his life, the footsteps that took him to that fateful moment, and then crucially, what happened afterwards, after those kind of mad few seconds on Constitution Hill. And that was, really only episode 1 of the podcast, because the twist, it turns out, if you didn't know this, is that 7 different men tried to attack Queen Victoria during her reign. Most of them fired at her with pistols. One of them manages to club her with a stick. All of them fail to kill her, but all of them provoke really interesting responses from the press, from the public, from artists, from songwriters, from judges, from lawyers, from doctors. They are these kind of major national crises, these major events. And so it makes a really good format for a limited series podcast. You effectively have 7 men, 7 stories, and we told them over the course of 7 different episodes. And each episode allowed us to explore different themes. So one of the attackers, for instance, came from Ireland, so we were able to use that as a way to explore the experiences of Irish migrants in Victorian London, as well as anti-Irish sentiment and Anglo-Irish relations. Some of them suffered from mental health problems, so it allowed us to explore that. Some ended up in asylums, others in prisons, some were transported to Australia. All of them, while they kind of do this very similar thing of attacking Victoria in public, all of them had their own interesting backgrounds, their own motivations, and then their own experiences. So we kind of had this repeating format that worked, I think, really well over the course of 7 separate episodes. So that was the setup for the podcast, and I'd like to think it worked well. I'm really proud of the work we did on it. What I thought I would do is give you now, I'm going to play now a 4-minute clip. It's the first 4 minutes of episode 1, so I'm not jumping in and spoiling it any further if any of you want to tune in. And what I'm going to do afterwards is talk about the building blocks of that 4-minute clip. So for now, just have a listen to it and hopefully you kind of enjoy it. I'm going to awkwardly sit here for 4 minutes while this plays out. And then when it's done, as I say, I'll come back and I'll explain a little bit about how we made it.
In August 1840, Madame Tussauds proudly unveiled the latest addition to their popular attraction, the Chamber of Horrors. It was, their advert declared, a full-length model taken from life of a monster caught in the act of attempting to kill Her Majesty Queen Victoria. The monster taking his place amongst infamous grave robbers, plotters and murderers was 18-year-old Edward Oxford. His waxwork would pull in the crowds well into the 20th century. But Edward wasn't unique. He was the first of 7 men to try and assassinate the Queen. My name is Dr. Bob Nicholson. I study the history of Victorian Britain, yet the 7 assailants were unknown to me, even though their lives intertwined with the most famous woman on the planet. What I found out about these men is not what I expected.
He had tried and tried to make it. Going after the Queen in 1849, I think, was his own act of rebellion.
Prince Alfred, Queen Victoria's second son, is shot twice in the back from a revolver.
Soft lead shot, when it makes contact with a body mass, it will simply smash the bone to pieces.
in the Edward Oxford trial. You couldn't wait for the next morning's newspaper for the latest instalment.
He's not going, "Oh my God, I've just tried to assassinate the Queen." He's upset about his looks.
Whether she was a young bride or even an elderly grieving widow, Victoria would always be a target.
I want to uncover what happened to these 7 men, what their stories reveal about the turbulent world of Victorian Britain, and quite frankly, I want to understand what on earth were they thinking. Killing Victoria, Episode 1, Edward Oxford. The Victorians were excellent record keepers, and I can use their meticulousness to try and get into Edward Oxford's head. I hope to find some answers by digging deep into the police archives, census returns, court reports, and the grubby world of Victorian newspapers. But first, I head to the scene of Edward's crime. I'm on Constitution Hill in central London, a broad, tree-lined road that runs from the corner of Hyde Park right up to the gates of Buckingham Palace. Today it's thronged with tourists, and they're peeking through the railings hoping to catch a little glimpse of royalty. And this scene would have looked remarkably similar on the 10th of June, 1840. Standing in the crowd then was a young man named Edward Oxford, anxiously waiting for Queen Victoria to make her appearance. He cut a dashing figure in his best trousers, waistcoat and frock coat, bought for a funeral 2 years earlier. Edward isn't here to cheer the Queen. Under that frock coat were 2 loaded pistols. For all his dashing good looks, Edward was a loner. Historian Paul Thomas Murphy.
People thought he was strange. He had very few friends, very little empathy for others, really couldn't hold a job. He was highly insecure. He was always an outsider.
I'm looking at genealogical records about Edward, and they give me some bare facts. He was born in 1822 in Birmingham, and his parents were Hannah and George, a jeweller by trade. Edward seems to have had 6 siblings, though only one of them, Susan, survived. The newspapers of 1840 say that after leaving school, Edward worked as a potboy in pubs in the West End of London. Now, a potboy was pretty much the lowest of the low in a Victorian pub. He collected up the empty glasses or pots, closed the window shutters every night, and emptied the spittoons. I went to a pub Edward might have known, the Yorkshire Grey, just north of Oxford Street. Edward worked in pubs at a time when pubs were changing. This was a time when lots of landlords were investing lots of new money in their premises, and they were doing things like installing fancy new gas lighting that would really make the place look inviting to punters. They were putting in stained glass that previously you maybe only would have seen in churches. Pubs were really getting a makeover. We now see Victorian pubs as being quite traditional and old, but... Oh, great. Thanks for bearing with me while that plays out. This is me now back with my current voice. Okay, so... That was a clip from the first sort of 4.5 minutes of episode 1. And I think for context, it's worth saying that clip involves a bit more sort of production than a sort of, let's say, a mid 4 minutes of the podcast would sound like, because it's the opening. There's a bit more music going on there. There's a little bit more sort of drama that we're looking to lay on. And it sort of eases into a slightly more kind of conversational style as the episode unfolds. But I thought it might be useful to think about, well, okay, there's a kind of a segment of a podcast, quite a sort of produced podcast. In some respects, if we just said this was a Radio 4 history documentary, it would have just sounded like that, wouldn't it? It probably wouldn't have been radically different. But these are the kind of segments that went into that you might start to identify. And you will see these, if you listen to the rest of the podcast series, you'll see these building blocks constantly being used and assembled in different combinations. So... there are some bits in there that are studio narration. So those are bits that we recorded right at the end of me sitting in a room a bit like that Dave's sitting in now, in front of a microphone with a producer, where I was reading out these short clips. And they're used as the kind of connective tissue of the podcast. They're kind of connecting the other elements together, bridging between the other clips that we've got. So they tend to be, aside from that opening bit, the opening kind of section, which I think was literally one of the final things we recorded for the podcast, They're usually quite short. They're often just a couple of sentences used to link from point A to point B. Then there's on-location narration. So in this case, I'll be on Constitution Hill. I went there to go there a lot of times because that's where a lot of the assassins struck. Those sections they sound a bit different. You get the background noise. They're recorded on a different type of mic. I'm often walking while doing it. I'm moving around a little bit more. And those sections are often a lot more improvisational. So the narration bits, occasionally you ad lib on those as you're doing it, but for the most part they're tightly scripted because they have a very particular job to do of get from that clip to that clip. Whereas the narration on location, I was often responding to what was in front of me, which often I saw for the first time when we arrived there. So I might in advance have jotted down some rough notes, have some bullet points that I want to hit, but they weren't scripted word for word. Then there are other elements where you will get me responding to documents. So in some cases, we literally went to the National Archives and looked at material there. But in other cases, of course, a lot of the research has been done online. And so we wanted to recreate that process of research. Now, that didn't mean like pointing a microphone at me for 8 hours while I troll through archives and hoping some kind of little gem occurs. You kind of have to stage that a little bit. So we did the research in advance in many cases, and then I would sort of react to it on mic. Sometimes one of the other production staff had found something and they showed it to me completely blind and sort of like respond to this authentically. So there are some sections of the podcast where you will hear me desperately trying to decipher 19th century handwriting and trying to respond to something where I'm seeing it literally for the first time. It's a bit like those scenes on the TV series, Who Do You Think You Are, where they sort of hand over a document to a celebrity and say, respond to what your great-great-grandfather's doing. We tried to do a little bit of that. We wanted a bit of the authentic joy and discovery and uncertainty of research. So you get those. There will then be sections from contributors, some of which were recorded on location in specific places. Others were recorded down the line over Zoom. And then finally, a lot of that is then knitted together with music, with sound effects. There's more music in that opening clip than there is elsewhere. We use it to kind of set the tone up front. Tends to ease off, and you just have it in occasional moments later when you need a change in tone. And so that's the sort of, those are the kind of the different building blocks that we used for most of the series, and you'll see them repeated. What I'm showing you here, don't worry if you can't read all the text, but these are 3 pages of the script that we eventually ended up with for the section that you've just heard. Now this is version 7 of that script, so you can kind of probably get a sense that this has evolved quite a lot. And the version we've got here is the version we were using for editing the podcast. So we did a lot of it actually using a program called Descript, which allows you to kind of edit in text and then the accompanying audio changes, which is quite useful for those of us who are more used to editing text documents than we are audio files. But this is a kind of version of it that I've exported for you to see. And I put these different colours on it. They correspond to the different types of audio. So blue for in the studio in front of a mic, green for on location, yellow for kind of sitting in a room somewhere else responding to documents, slightly off mic and in a way that feels a little bit more conversational and improvisational, and then red text for the contributors. And this is the kind of version we ended up with, but it's not the version we started with. This is the whole script for episode 1. Initially, the rough outline that we made as we were just beginning to map out what might it include. So for context, this one, these first 3 pages, the full script for episode 1 with all of those bits in it is about 25 pages. Whereas at this point, as we were starting out before recording was made, we're 2.5 really. And at this point, all we really needed to know were what might be some of the key locations we go to. So we actually went out on location. I was very surprised about this. I thought everything would be faked and I would just be sitting in a studio and it would all be sound effects. But no, if I say I'm on Constitution Hill outside of Buckingham Palace, that's where I am. If I say I'm at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, we actually went there to do a segment. You might sort of argue that that's a bit overkill for a podcast and nobody would have known if we faked it. But I think it allowed me to react a bit more authentically and spontaneously to the things around me in ways that, that were useful. So we had to find those key building blocks, places we were going to go. And we also had to find experts, people that we were going to talk to. And you can see in some cases here we're saying we need an expert on something, but we're not sure who they are yet. So this is sort of very much a working document. It doesn't fully reflect the structure of the final episode because, of course, once you get all those building blocks together, you start to see new ways to assemble them. But it was really important that we had the bare bones of a story before we started recording, because the last thing you want is to go all the way to the Isle of Wight, record something, and then later think, oh, actually, we really needed another bit from the Isle of Wight, and we've gone home. We have to go back on the ferry and go and sort it out again. So I think that kind of planning up front and thinking what are the kind of key beats of the story, what might be some of the key locations, I think that's a really useful way of starting to plan a podcast. So last little bit from me. Dave said it up front, he's absolutely right, that this was kind of very much one end of the spectrum for a podcast, in that actually the production of it is not unlike what would have been for a standard sort of Radio 4 documentary. It was not just me and a microphone going and doing all this solo. There were a lot of people involved. And I sort of feel like whenever I talk publicly about this, it's like I'm taking credit for it. It is my podcast, but it was very much a team effort. So there was a producer, Jonathan Mayo, who was absolutely central in all of this. He co-wrote some of the sections. He assembled a lot of the rough cuts. He directed the recording sessions. He coordinated the whole project. So when you hear that somebody's a podcast producer, they're not just kind of sitting back smoking cigars while other people get on with it. They are often doing literally everything. A podcast producer can almost be a writer, editor, presenter, and doing all the behind the scenes stuff. So while most of the things I say on the podcast are scripted by me, the assembling of it all was very much a joint effort, and a lot of that was Jonathan. We then had an assistant producer who was a trained historian who also did some of the kind of behind the scenes work, going to archives and rooting out documents, pre-interviewing guests before we did the main interview. Actually did some fact checking too. Was really, really important. It was Lizzie. There are then executive producers. These are people sitting within BBC studios who are, like, if you like, operate above the project, but who we had to keep going to with drafts and with sections to say, are you happy with it? Do you want us to push it in a different direction? And a lot of the podcast is very much a response to their feedback. Then you have me as a sort of writer and presenter figure. So my role in all of this was obviously to be the on-mic presenter of it. I did quite a lot of the supporting research as well. And I wrote most of the sections, and then had quite a bit of input more and more as the project went on as to how we were going to edit it together. We also had a genealogist that the BBC employed to sort of do some genealogical research on some of the key figures and just make sure we had all the facts straight on them. We had multiple, like over a dozen contributors, mostly expert historians, but some of them were people with personal connections to the assassins, their descendants. We also then had a composer who came in and actually wrote that music. So it is original music for this series. Though, of course, you could just as easily get good enough sound from a kind of website that just has a bank of free-to-use sounds. And then the BBC also have editors who then mix the final thing together. And then finally, administrators, people who book all the travel, hotels, the health and safety things. There is an episode where I shoot a gun that had to go through quite a lot of red tape at the BBC to make sure that was all okay. So this is a big outfit. And by showing all this, I don't want you to sort of think, oh my God, making a podcast requires enormous amounts of money and all these people. Like, it would be possible to do something 80-90% of the way towards what we did with Killing Victoria with, I think, just one person and a microphone who has then the time and the skills and the sort of patience to put it all together. But I was very lucky that I got to make something with a team behind me, because it allowed us to do things at a scale that we probably wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So that was an example of a podcast that I've worked on recently. I'm going to pass back to Dave now to tell you about a podcast that I contributed to a little bit as well, but is very much his project.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Bob. I'm not going to talk quite such length about this because we need to crack on and get some good advice to you. But Bob's series is brilliant, and you should definitely listen to it. It's like a really good example of how you can really make history work in the podcast environment. Hopefully, what I did with this series, The Tiger Tamer Who Went to Sea, is similar. It was I've made hundreds of podcasts, most of them, as I said, one-to-one interviews. This one again was a scripted series. It was the retelling of the life of a curious Victorian semi-celebrity called Bob Carlyle, who achieved a level of fame by becoming Britain's first and greatest long-distance wheelbarrow pedestrian. He pushed a wheelbarrow from Land's End to John O'Groats in 1879 and repeated the trick several times through to the Edwardian period. A bizarre story, broadly untold as far as I could see, and rich fodder for the podcast environment because he provided a very neat narrative arc. And his life also provided a window into many other aspects of late Victorian and Edwardian Britain. His life crosses into sport, entertainment, culture, travelling circuses, media and newspapers, Anglo-American relations, global maritime trade and shipping, temperance and anti-temperance, and the rapid change in terrestrial travel technology with the rise of bicycles and cars, rather overshadowing his efforts at wheelbarrow locomotion. So I thought that's an amazing story to tell, and I wanted to tell it, and I gathered a crack team of historians to chat to me in much the same way as Bob did with his series, including a certain Bob Nicholson, to tell us about some of those themes that his story intersects with. And that for me is kind of one of the superpowers of podcasting, because it allows space for tangents and diversions that other mediums cannot tolerate so well. And it also democratizes matters somewhat. If you think there's a story to be told, you can do it. You don't necessarily need to convince gatekeepers of the merits of the topic. You can tackle subjects that might appear more niche, though I would say there's a fine line between tackling a topic that might not get attention in other media and indulgent navel gazing. So be careful about it. But it does mean podcasting is a space where you can explore things that you might not otherwise do. Do you want to hop on to the next slide, Bob? Okay, cool. If you just go through all of them, yeah, brilliant. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I just wanted to say that we use quite a few people as well, much less than the resources that the BBC has. Though I work for BBC History Magazine, I actually work for an independent company, Immediate Media. So we adhere to all BBC guidelines and such like, but I don't actually have the resources of the BBC behind me to do it. But nevertheless, to make a scripted series like that, if you want to do it in a timely fashion, you do need help and you do need other people to do stuff. But as Bob and I were sort of chatting about what we'd say in the seminar beforehand, we did agree that actually you could do, someone who knows enough about editing and recording and making podcasts could do most of these things, with the possible exception of composing music. So it is feasible. But I don't want you to get the impression that you need to put this level of effort into creating podcasts. There are many other ways to create podcasts, many other things that you can do. So should we hop on, Bob, yeah, thank you. Okay. One thing I just wanted to make super clear, though, is if you do start a podcast, one of the biggest issues you'll get, certainly starting a podcast in 2024, it was much less of an issue in 2007, is getting heard, is finding space in a very congested podcast market. As you saw in my sort of opening slide, loads and loads of history podcasts from some really high profile historians have launched in the last few years, and they eat up a lot of the publicity. Most people find their podcasts through podcast players like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and it's very, very hard to get your podcast to the top of the list there. You need to kind of work the algorithms a bit. You need to get people to rate and review you nicely. You need to make sure you've got a snappy title and that you have a really clear description of what it is, which kind of gets some keywords through that people might be searching on. But nevertheless, it is a struggle. One of the things that you might want to think about is cover art. As I've said, I think both of those podcast series that we talked about have really striking cover art, and it's an overlooked bit of the game. People will need to see something nice before they decide to click on it and listen to it. And then the other aspect is trying to find something that's press worthy, something that might get you talked about beyond the podcast space, so that people might hear about you. So with the Tiger Tamer example, this chap, he did some very odd things with wheelbarrows, and it was newsworthy. He started a wheelbarrow craze in 1886, and that's it's just a bit odd. So I was able to wangle my way onto a few radio programs to talk about that, because it gave you a hook. So if you can find hooks like that, then it gives you just that little bit of a chance to get talked about. Right, Bob, should we crack on? So I thought what would be really helpful would be to, I just asked some of my podcasting friends, colleagues and competitors for tips from their experience. So we're just going to go through a few tips from people and talk about what they've told us. So first guy, Dominic Sambrook from The Rest is History, which is now an absolutely massive podcast. I think, probably one of the biggest podcasts made by a production company called Goalhanger, with lots of resources behind it, really knowing how to do stuff and really driving the agenda. And what Dominic says there, I'll read it quickly. It's pretty obvious that the formula is simple. All you need to do is tell a really good story. That's it. The story is king. The characters are the stars, not the presenters. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't overthink it. Just pick a good story, tell it with enthusiasm, and you're done. And I think that is there's something really in that, is that he and his co-presenter Tom Holland, whatever you think of the popular history books that they write, are definitely really, really good storytellers, and that comes across in the podcast they do. They work out how to tell the story, and it's the same thing that Bob did with Killing Victoria, telling a story, making sure that there is a story going through. And it's really, really important in podcasting. It really demands that storytelling narrative. Did you want to add anything to that, Bob?
Oh, no, just to agree that was one of the challenges we had with Killing Victoria. You know, we knew we had 7 men, and for some of them the stories were really easy, but for some of the other ones, finding that story, you know, often when there wasn't as much documentary evidence about them, or where it didn't have the same obvious kind of sort of 3-act structure of what did they do before the assassin and then what did they do afterwards, that was trickier. So the Irish assassin Hamilton, once he gets transported to Australia, he disappears from the records. We don't know what happened to him. So thinking about how to tell that story was quite challenging. So yeah, I think it was really essential, and it took a lot of work to find a way to turn stories that aren't always like natural stories into things that would work and have a kind of satisfying resolution.
Yeah, but it is important to try and find that story. And even if you're just doing an interview, it is really helpful if you have the idea of a start, middle, and end of the interview so that you are following a story. We'll talk a little bit more about interview technique in a bit, maybe. Should we hop on to the next one?
Yeah.
So Lucy Worsley, famous TV historian who does a BBC podcast called Lady Killers. I think that a lot of leisure podcasters don't realise the quantity and consistency are key. You really need to do 50 episodes a year. Now, you don't actually need to do quite that much, but the underlying point, in my view, is correct, is that quality and consistency are super important. You have to remember that you are lending your listeners are lending their ears and putting their trust in what you're putting out, and the payback they expect is they will get a regular stream of content that they know is of a similar format and consistency, so they don't have to go out and search for more podcasts. Now, regularity can be intermittent, i.e. you can do series for 6 episodes, 8 episodes, and then take a break and come back, but be clear about what you're offering. And consistency of style, quality, and approach, and to some extent length, is really helpful in keeping listeners with you. So I think it is important. If you're going to do a podcast, you need to kind of commit to doing it with some level of regularity and make sure your listeners know what regularity it is they can expect. And then we've got Greg Jenner here, who does the fantastic You're Dead to Me podcast series, again, for the BBC. We've got a couple of quotes from him. Now, he's a great podcaster, a great public historian, and this is just a very good piece of advice. Speaking at a good measured pace and without long, unwieldy sentences like I'm doing on this seminar is very important for how you'll be edited. And also, lots of people listen on 1.5 or 2 times speed, so a gabbler doesn't sound good when sped up. Now, that might surprise you, that last clause, but it's true. A lot of people do listen to podcasts at double speed. So if you are speaking fast, you're going to be really fast in people's ears, and it might be a turn-off. So try and moderate your speech a little bit. And just about if you are a naturally fast speaker, just try and slow down. And crucially, when you are chatting, if you do misspeak or say something you think is incorrect, it's really helpful when you're editing or someone else is editing to take a pause and start the sentence again. Don't just kind of go straight back into it. Take a pause so that it's really easy to chop that bit out. It's kind of, you need to think about the way that you speak a little bit, and it comes with practice, because you will find that it's much more complicated to edit if you speak in a truly natural fashion. That said, should we go on to the next one?
Yeah, I should just add to say that was one of the things as a presenter for Killing Victoria, was I think I felt like I'd learned the most by the end of it, was starting to speak in a way that would be helpful to an editor, and recognizing the kind of points where I should stop and take a breath. And also moments where, where if I do make a mistake, where I can pick up from again. That was definitely something that it took me a while to figure out. I didn't just do that day one, but it's definitely something I'm a lot better at now, having done 7 episodes of it.
Okay, so his second point is a bit more wordy, but I'm gonna read it again just in case people can't see it. I would always advise the historian on a podcast to explain the subject in a conversational style, as if they were sat across the table from someone in a pub. This conversational intimacy with its warmer tone of voice still allows for detailed nuance, big ideas, etc., but it doesn't project the usual dynamics of authority figure lecturing to a passive listener. Instead, it makes the listener feel included and that they are in the company of a passionate and knowledgeable person who is speaking with them, not at them. And I think there's a lot in that. You need to think about what it is your listeners might be doing while they are listening to the podcast. There's a very good chance they're doing something else: walking the dog, washing up, driving to work, running a marathon. And also, as I said earlier, they're very likely to be having you piped directly and personally into their heads with some expensive earphones. So it's a very intimate experience. And that's why it's good to try and frame it with a bit of personality and, as Greg says, to talk with them, not at them, which is why I find lectures and sort of delivered talks, that they don't work so well on podcasts generally, because they do feel a bit like it's an authority figure, and authority figures in podcasts don't necessarily gel so well.
Yeah, I think my favourite bits of Killing Victoria when I listen back to it were not the kind of more presentery bits. Actually, a bit like the bit I played you at the start. I think the bits that work best are the bits where I'm off the cuff and just responding to things and chatting almost if I'm just speaking to the producer who's holding the microphone rather than sort of projecting as a presenter. I think if I were to make it again, we would do even more of that more conversational approach with a bit of structure to it. But I think for me, it just feels more natural and more engaging. We discovered that as we were doing it and then did more and more of it as it went. But yeah, I think it's definitely good advice from Greg.
And then this is from Alex Churchill, who does a great podcast called History Hack, an independent one, just for a bit of a dose of reality. In the beginning, be prepared to work very hard for absolutely nothing while barely anyone listens. It'll be worth it in the end, I promise. So a note of positivity at the end. But just, it is important to bear in mind, as I said earlier, podcasting is a very congested space right now, and you may find that you're talking into the abyss a little bit if you start your own podcast. And we'll talk a little bit maybe about how you might get involved in other people's podcasts in a minute. But just to go on to this next one from Charles West, who does a really good podcast series, Europe in the 11th Century, quite academic. And I think this is a really important point he lands here. Be clear in your own mind about what or who your podcast is for. Are you creating it for a scholarly community or for a bigger public? Podcasting gets a lot of attention for the latter, i.e. podcasting as a kind of public outreach / impact, but it's also a good tool for building connections and reflecting on developments within a field. And that's equally as valid a reason for doing it if it's not for profit. So Charles there, I think his really important point that he's making is that you obviously need to think about who it is who's going to be listening to the podcast, why you personally are doing it and what you hope to get out of it, because then clearly you will have a much better idea about where you want to go and what a good result is for you. And then finally from my guest, Hallie Rubenhold, who does a great podcast called Bad Women. It requires nearly as much time and planning as writing an actual non-fiction book. With Bad Women, we would start work on the research, the scripts and expert interviews in the late winter and begin recording in the studio in the late spring. It amounted to about 10 months of solid work for each season, and that was with a producer, assistant producer, sound designer, and 2 researchers. Podcasts will eat your life, and it's very hard, if not impossible, to write a book alongside doing one if it's narrative-based. So proceed with caution, choose your format carefully, and weigh it against the amount of time you have available to give it. So I think that kind of just builds on Charles's point a bit, is that obviously you need to be realistic about what it is that you're trying to do. Pick a format that you can make sure you can deliver on. Think about what we've just said earlier about which formats are more easy to deliver and the amount of time you might be subscribing to if you try and produce something really scripted and high production based. You need to make sure that you can do something which you can commit to with regularity if you want to start your own podcast. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I think for Killing Victoria, from starting on the project to it finally appearing and then also doing the promo around it, it was at least 8 months. And while, not every week was working on it full time, most weeks I'd be spending at least a day or two, and some weeks it would be full weeks on it. So yeah, big project.
Cool. So just to summarize my 3 rules of podcasting, there aren't really any rules of podcasting, but just things that I think about when I'm making podcasts is the first one, make it listenable. Audio quality is absolutely key. Invest in the time and perhaps in microphones to make sure that the audio quality is suitable for going directly into someone's ears. Think about your audience, think about why it is you're doing something, who might be listening and what they want to get out of it and what you want to get out of it. And thirdly, try and tell a story in whatever format you're delivering. Podcasting really requires stories. That's its beauty. That's where it works best. So find the story in whatever it is that you are doing. Now, we kind of got some time for Q&As, but I've pulled together some sort of basic info here, which might be better to just kind of share in the deck afterwards, I guess, for people. But in terms of basics, if you're going to start your own pod, just a couple of things here. Obviously, you need to create some content. You need to have enough material to drop into a feed for it to be accepted by one of the providers. So you need to have at least an episode and a trailer. Ideally, you'd make a few episodes so you're ready to go so you can drop in that regular content. And then the next thing you do is you create a feed. You find a podcast hosting platform, of which there are many, and then you get in touch with them. You may have to pay for some level of access, but some of them are free. You set it up, it's a pretty easy process, and then it will be distributed to all the platforms. So find one that suits what you want to do and suits your budget. And you can always move later on. And then just like super basic process of uploading a podcast, you create an episode, you will have an MP3 format, no doubt. You upload the file, you add episode data to it, which is titles, descriptions, episode numbers, etc., keywords important. Then you schedule it for release, try and make sure that you can be releasing with a regular basis. And then you will no doubt have some sort of data sheet or data board on your podcast provider, so you can see what sort of listens you're getting. And obviously, if you're paying for a premium service, you'll get more data and analytics. And then just a couple of things about what to do. I think if you are doing a sort of an interview-based podcast, when I do an interview, I do podcast interviews at least once a week, probably more than once a week. 4 questions I always ask myself: how would you answer the questions that you're posing? What's the story you want to follow? What's the story you want the listeners to get as you go through? Are you going to get through that story in a reasonable time? Do you need to cut out bits? Can you allow yourself tangents and diversions? And obviously thinking about the audience, do you need to provide a big setup, or can you dive straight in? Do they need to know the ins and outs of whatever the topic is, or can you just assume that there is a certain level of knowledge? And that obviously depends on who you think your audience is. And then in terms of editing is pretty easy, actually. You may think, oh, crikey, that sounds really hard. The software tool that Bob described, Descript, is a really powerful tool that actually makes it super easy to edit. You're basically editing a Word document, a text file of what is said, and you can just cut out words, and that will edit the audio as well. So it's actually super easy. Obviously, there are more advanced packages like Audacity and things like that, but for a basic level editing, there are all tools that make it really easy. AI has democratized the process, so it's very good to do a first pass yourself. That's really helpful, just to go through and sort of cut out the bits where you think definitely they shouldn't be in there, or it's just a lengthy diversion that doesn't really need to be there. But then it's really good to get someone else to go over it. There are bits you won't want to lose, but someone else be more rigorous. And I think it's important to think about length a bit. We haven't talked about length very much. Podcasts can just ramble on. There is no time limit on a podcast. Some of them go on for literally hours, and some formats demand that and accept that. But that doesn't mean that all podcasts need to go on for hours. Cutting out the fat generally makes for a better listening experience. So I would err on the side of cutting more than keeping everything. I think you need to keep your audience on side. And then just some tech tips here, which we still got time. Yeah, we have, haven't we? So first one on the mic, just get a USB mic is a really good thing to do, just really helpful. They're easy to set up. You don't need to do much more than just plug it in and make sure you've selected it on whatever podcast recording tool you're using. Pick a good space to record if you possibly can. I'm in a dedicated studio here, which is great. You don't need a dedicated studio, just a small quiet room, hopefully with some soft furnishings to bounce the sound around in a warm fashion. That's really important. No windows open, no banging noises outside. Try and keep the external noises as to a minimum if you possibly can. You don't absolutely need to edit your recordings. If you do a really clean podcast chat, or you're just speaking a script and you think it's fine, you don't necessarily need to edit, but editing will always make it sound better and give you a more professional feel. That said, you don't need to over edit. I think podcasting is that personal, intimate experience. So it does allow for certain idiosyncrasies to come through and sometimes mistakes and things. That's fine. It depends what you're trying to do and who you think your audience is, but you don't need to make it a completely polished Radio 4 style standard with everything. And then finally, crucially, think like a listener. That you have to keep in mind what your listener's going to be doing and what it is they want out of the podcast. So just bear in mind who they are and what they're going to be doing.
I guess just last thing I would add on the equipment side of things. This was really interesting for me to see actually what was being used in obviously quite a high production value BBC podcast. Well, obviously some of it we were in a studio, proper studio space with really high quality mics, but a lot of the on location stuff we recorded with a handheld recorder and just its built-in mic. And it's a company called Zoom, not the same company that makes the software we're using now, but they make a lot of those handheld recorders that have a varying number of kind of inputs if you need lots of mics plugged into them. But you can get a kind of mid-level Zoom handheld recorder for maybe £200, £300, something like that, maybe even a little bit less. Depending on which model you want to go for. And that will do a lot of what you need. If you use it well, if you're attentive to the environment, if you handle it carefully, they can pick up a lot of noise if you're kind of moving around a lot. But actually, a lot of what we did was done on a relatively simple bit of equipment where it was just a case of the producer I worked with holding it and me speaking into it while we're standing, in a field on the Isle of Wight. So you don't necessarily need extremely glamorous equipment. But But it'll be worth thinking, what type of podcast do you want to make? Because do you need a mic that's portable, that you can take to different places, that you can do on location? Or do you just need something that you're going to plug into your computer and record at home, or do online things with? Some of them, you can get mics that will do both. So there's handheld recorders you can plug in with like a USB cable into your computer, and then they will then act as a microphone that you can use for calls like this. So it's worth doing a little bit of research and thinking, what type of podcaster will you be, and then thinking what type of mic really suits those needs. But it is possible just to buy one mic that does it.
Yeah, and those Zoom mics that you talked about, Bobby, those we use those, and you can plug them in and use them as sort of USB microphones for online conversations as well. They can be really good. You are paying a bit for them, but they are very versatile. One thing I would just add to that is you can, even if you spent £1,000 on a microphone, that it's more important to make sure that what you're recording is as clean as it possibly can be when it's actually happening. If there is someone hammering a nail into the wall next to you, the best microphone in the world isn't going to help you solve that. So stop the person hammering the nail into the wall before you start recording. It sounds simple, but a lot of people don't do it and think, oh, well, we can just clear that up in the edit. Clearing up in the edit can be a really time-consuming process, particularly if you're trying to do it yourself. So avoid that if you possibly can.
And if you're out on location, the absolute bane of it is traffic. Like we tune it out so much as people that we don't even really sort of hear when there are cars driving by, but my goodness, do you hear it on audio? And we had so many instances as well of just planes flying over, particularly when you're in London, when you're under all those flight paths. I would often have like a sort of 30-second window between planes going over where I'd have to nail a take and then it'd be ready. So like things that we don't even think about, the kind of everyday noise of everyday life, we just tune it out. There's somewhere from the distance my tumble dryer is on at the minute, but I would not have it on if I was doing a really audio sensitive podcast. So you will learn the hard way when you go to listen back and you pick up on all those little things. It's good to actually do some monitoring of your audio if you're out in the field and actually just listen back and see, does it sound good? But yeah, those are kind of some good tech tips. I think we're on to questions now, so I'll stop sharing my screen and we can go into the next section.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much to both of you. I will just dive into the question and answer. We've got quite a few questions coming in, if that's all right. So I'll put them across to you, and some of them I'll combine because we've got similar topics as well. But the first question we have in is probably one for you, Bob, to think about. It comes from Gary Willis. From an academic point of view, thinking about history podcasts as resources for undergraduate students, do you feel a history podcast is a citable secondary source? What do you think? It's dissertation time. You'll be marking them soon, I imagine. You want to see some podcasts in there? What do you think?
Yes, I mean, look, my ultimate philosophy is that everything is citable if you use it critically and carefully. So I wouldn't do a blanket ban on it. Like any form of publishing, the podcast will vary enormously in quality. So for Killing Victoria, we did a full fact check on everything. So there are versions of those scripts that are fully footnoted, where every claim is linked back to another source. I don't want to speak for the podcast. I suspect there are many historians who are just as rigorous, but there will be some who aren't. So in the same way that there is really good history on Twitter and other forms of social media, and then astonishing amounts of misinformation, the same is absolutely true on podcasts. The beauty of podcasts is anyone can make them, but then as a sort of source of trustworthy knowledge, well, who knows? So I would say, the things I would tell my students are be aware of who's made it. Are they a credible figure in that field? Are there other ways that we can assess their credibility? But yeah, I think we shouldn't dissuade students from engaging with podcasts because they could be really, really useful sources. And I really do believe they could be. I think they're currently being underused as the format for presenting serious, rigorous academic research. There's no reason why they can't be as rigorous as a journal article. But we need to teach students how to approach them critically as we would do any web source. But so there's sort of work for us to do almost before they get to those dissertations, I think, to make sure they're using it well.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really, really valuable advice. The next question, you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but maybe a question for both of you as well, which is that when speaking with specialists, academic specialists, that maybe aren't quite as comfortable, it comes from Coley Lee, this question, I should say. Any advice on encouraging confidence in academic specialists who are not so comfortable in front of a mic, who, for example, find that kind of off-the-cuff approach difficult when they are, so engaged in the research they're doing? Do you have any tips maybe for opening that up and creating that intimacy that you spoke about?
You go on, Bob.
No, you go. This is definitely one for you, Dave. I'll come in as well, but you go for it.
I mean, I always say just think in advance what it is, the points that you think you're going to want to land, the main things you're going to want to get across in the interview, and write them down and just think about it and think about the sorts of questions that might come to you and how you might be able to put those points in. I always find that cue cards are just really handy, just little things. If you're out and about sort of trying to record OB type things, outside broadcast things like Bob was talking about, just have some cue cards saying, I need to say, this fact happened at this point, and then just look at it for 5 seconds before you speak, and then you don't try and read it, but just it will stay in your memory for 5 seconds, and try and do little snippets, like small segments. You don't need to be able to recite a whole essay. Just do a small segment, then look at your cue card again, and you can do another bit. So I think that's that's a really helpful tool too. That's what I do when I'm out and about. Just have it written down. So okay, these are the 5 things I need to do. I'm going to get through them.
I would say as well that when I've been on the other side of this and being an interviewee in these circumstances where sometimes you're going and you're not entirely sure what you're going to be asked, and you kind of worry, am I going to come across in the right kind of way? And I always afterwards overanalyze it and think, did I say that exactly as I wanted? So I think even as somebody who's done quite a bit of this, I still have that part of me that thinks, oh, I could have been more eloquent there. Why did I do that off the cuff? But what I've invariably found in almost everything I've done is that anything I've done badly has been saved by an editor who has gone in and made me sound much better, who has taken out my ums and ahs, who has kind of clipped bits together and got rid of my weird tangent. So I think if you're working with a really good producer, and most people, most producers are, they will make you look good, right? It's not in their interests to present you as hesitant or uncertain. They will sort of fix it in post, as it were, sometimes as well. So I think there's a lot to be said of like trusting the person you're working with to present you faithfully and in the best possible light as well. But there's loads of times where I've said in an interview, you know what, can I have another run at that? I've sort of worked my way towards an answer in the course of giving it, and then thought, there is a much better way to do this, let me start again. And never has somebody said, no, your first one is the only one we can accept. So I think have the confidence to sort of say, yeah, can I have another run at that? I don't know whether other people do that with you, Dave, but I definitely do now. I think it's worth it.
All the time, and I heartily recommend it. I think that's an absolutely perfect thing to do. Just say, look, I can do that in a better way. I'm going to start again. Remind me what the question is, and then puts it back onto the interview. You buy yourself another couple of seconds to think about it, and then off you go again. And it's very rare that podcasts are live. In fact, by definition, they ought to not be really. So there is always that opportunity for editing. And quite often people will email me afterwards and say, do you know what? I'm not sure I got my facts right on that thing. So can you just listen again? And did I definitely say 1879? And if not, then we can chop that out. It's easy.
That's great. Thank you very much. And now to seamlessly transition into the next question is describing that benefit of production, of editing, of all the rest of it. We've got a few questions coming through. Got one from Mike Asbester, one from David Hendy, and another one somewhere down here as well. I can see one come up in the chat as well from Guy Collender, all asking about the commissioning process. So in order to kind of get yourself to that situation where you are benefiting from that in the long run, few people asking, I guess maybe from both your perspectives, how somebody would go about pitching, but then also commissioning something on history podcasting.
I guess I can talk a little bit about my experiences with Killing Victoria. So the bit missing from this story is that, and frustratingly for this question, is that this is not a project I pitched. So in many cases, an academic or somebody with a story will pitch to a production company and will, approach them and say, look, I've got a great story. Do you think this could be made? And then they'll develop that into a pitch that then will be taken to a platform that might then commission it. With Killing Victoria, I was very lucky. They'd basically the BBC had come up with this idea, had commissioned it, and then they were looking for someone to present it. And they contacted me as a potential just guest on it. And somehow I think I managed to talk myself into presenting the whole thing, which was very, very good. But it left me sort of thinking, well, actually, how do I repeat the trick here? So since making Killing Victoria, I had been pitching other podcasts that would be a kind of spiritual successor to it. And I have, so like full disclosure, I have not got another thing commissioned, even though that podcast was really successful, because I found stories that I think really worked well, but it just didn't quite have the ingredient people were looking for at the time. So I guess one of the things that I have learned is that, it takes a while to learn what commissioners want. And I know quite a lot of that now, but there are still some things where you think, I've got a great story, but I just don't quite have that ingredient that they want this time. So it can be quite a brutal process. I've spent weeks or sometimes months developing ideas for podcasts that then haven't yet got commissioned, but I'm determined to make them still somehow. But it is absolutely possible to approach, companies that make podcasts. I'm sure it would be fine to email them out of the blue, say, hey, look, I've got this story, and if it's good, I'm sure they'll be wanting to talk to you. But yeah, Dave, I don't know anything more on the sort of pitching side.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that. Yeah, I think it's absolutely. If you've got a good story and you don't think it's being told in the way that you think it could be told, then media companies will be interested. There are a lot of podcast companies out there trying to do these things. So you need to make sure that whatever it is you're pitching, fits into what their output generally is. So if all they do is debate panel podcast and you say we need to do a scripted series, they're unlikely to buy into that. So obviously you need to do a bit of research about the sort of formats that they do. But you also need to make sure that you sound like a legitimate, credible person who also has the sort of vocal tones that are going to work on a podcast. So I would start by the point of having done some podcasts, made your own, started doing it, so that a potential commissioner can actually see that you can deliver on doing something, and have that as to be ready to pass on to them. But then I would definitely say a short synopsis of the way you think the story could pan out is the way to open the conversation, and then to think about how you can bring in other elements to it so that it's more than just a single story, because I think people will want to know that it can be built out from more than one episode. They'll want to have a multi-part episode ideally if they can get out of it. So how can it be built out? And they'll also want to know that it's sort of tenable in an economic way. So if it requires somebody to go to Bolivia for 6 weeks, that's going to be problematic. So and most podcasts would not require that. So just be careful about sort of overestimating what's involved.
It's worth saying that Killing Victoria, as I understand it, it got commissioned, number one, because it's about Queen Victoria, and the BBC knows that people will click on things that are about Queen Victoria. And I should say, I am not somebody previously who had worked on the history of the monarchy. I'm a historian of pop culture. So, it took a while for me to be persuaded that I wanted to work on her. But that was definitely, and then the kind of true crime angle, which is obviously, really popular now as well. So that kind of had two big ticks. I think the only sort of third big tick it would have been if I was somehow descended from one of the assassins, and then we kind of had a personal angle too. Then it would have kind of hit all the bases that the BBC were looking for in podcasts at that moment. And that sort of personal angle of why me, why now is often the hardest thing for us as historians. And not every production company wants that, but it is a thing you'll see increasingly in history documentaries, that they have that kind of personal angle, which is frustrating sometimes when we've got a great story but not that connection.
Imagine the pitch might have been even easier still if you're descended from Queen Victoria.
Yeah.
One of the assassins. So I've got another question now from Emily Rose Hay, and it ties into this kind of discussion of true crime that you've just introduced there as well. We have, as a historian researching very sensitive stories of crime, how would you recommend balancing the need to handle stories ethically and in a nuanced manner with the need to make stories entertaining and engaging for a mass audience?
Yeah, sorry, Dave, do you want to go in on that? Or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a really good question, and one we think about a lot when we're doing podcasts. I mean, the beauty of podcasts is that you can preface information. You can talk about the way you're approaching it. You can have a good conversation about what it is that you want to discuss. Bring in some other contributors to talk about it as well. So you don't need to necessarily be really sort of salacious in the detail and have a really sexy story you're selling. You can discuss it and say why it's interesting on its own merits, and podcasting allows for that space to be to exist, and you can do it at whatever length you want. So podcasting is ideal for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think this is a good example. We can look at Hallie Rubenholz's podcast Bad Women, which looks at the victims of the Jack the Ripper, the Whitechapel murder. That could, on the face of it, be the most over the top sensational style of podcast, and of course it's leaning into established interest in that topic. But its whole point is to come at it from a more nuanced point of view and a more thoughtful point of view. So I think there's an appetite for that. Though, obviously there is also an appetite for the more lurid approaches to true crime, and plenty of people in the podcast space will just happily do that. I don't think you should feel pressured to do that. I think, if you think that there's cause for a more thoughtful way of doing it, you can still tell a great story. And I think people will still be drawn to the topic without having to really lean into the most lurid parts of it.
That's great. Now, you spoke about it a little bit towards the end of your presentation there, Dave, and I wondered, people are asking a lot about kind of length. We're getting some stuff about length of episodes. Kate Bradley asks, what is the kind of the ideal length? Saying personally hates anything longer than 30 minutes unless it's a special thing. We've had a question from Eloise Kane about the word count and running length of each episode of Killing Victoria. But is there any research out there, Kate was asking, about, kind of the perfect length or anything that says, this is where you want to hit in terms of, you mentioned don't go for 2.5 hours or something like that. But is there something out there that says, you've got a real sweet spot in terms of what to aim for?
There aren't any specific rules on length of podcasts, and that's one of the beauty of podcasts. You can, if you are suitably verbose and eloquent, have a podcast that goes on for many hours, but you need to be able to really master narrative to make that a tenable thing to do. There's a reason why Radio 4 programs about half an hour, because that is a good amount of time that people can tend to engage with anything, to be honest. And I think one of the things you need to think about is, it goes back to the regularity point, regularity and consistency of release. If someone's listening to your podcast and they like it, they're probably fitting it into their day. They're probably fitting it into a routine, in which case they have a certain amount of time in which they do something. So if they listen to a podcast and your podcast is characteristically 45 minutes long, then they know they can listen to that on their 45-minute dog walk or their 45-minute commute. If you then come in with a podcast which is 15 minutes, then they're going to think, oh man, I've only got to the halfway turn on the dog walk and I've got nothing to listen to. So that will disappoint them. So I would say try and just maintain a level of length which is consistent across your release output, and then your listeners will know what they're getting to. And some podcasts can be super short, and then that's absolutely fine. On History Extra, we tend to go for about 30 to 40 minutes because that feels like the right sort of length for getting decent conversations where you can get into a decent chunk of a topic without necessarily going far too deep that people think I just can't commit to spending this amount of time listening to it into a topic.
I think it might also depend on just the type of thing you're doing in the podcast. So if it's just you talking and nothing else, I think that would suit quite a short podcast, but it's quite hard to sustain one person talking in the same way for 40 minutes. So with Killing Victoria, I was showing you all those building blocks. One of the key things we were trying to do there is, if we're going over a 30, 40-minute running length, we don't want it just to be my voice in the same kind of tone with the same kind of texture for that 40 minutes. We wanted to punctuate it and break it up again and again and again. So there is, I won't tell you which example. This is an interesting little Easter egg here. If you listen, try and guess. There was a section that I wrote, but it was too much of me. And so we got another historian to say it, literally word for word, what I wrote. I will not disclose who that historian is. They were very helpful and it was very useful to us, but it just broke up that section that was too much of me. And I think that can also affect running time. So if I was making a podcast solo with no other guests, where it's just me in front of a microphone, I would look to do shorter pieces for that, where you can hold someone's attention. But if you want to go longer, I would think about how to punctuate that time so that it doesn't drag effectively, so that we have all those different bits. In the same way that, Dave have been going back and forth and all of this, it hopefully holds interest. I think it's a kind of cliche now, isn't it, that modern audiences don't have an attention span and they need everything to be just edited to a sort of in a very snappy, quick way. Not to the point where like every 5 seconds you're changing your sort of your location, but yeah, think about how to sustain a longer length if you're going to do it.
Just on that point about modern audiences not having attention span, podcasting is one place where actually you do get really good, strong engagement for an extended period. They may be doing something else, but they are also allowing you to be to be in their ears. So actually, it is the most engaged place for an audience for many media outlets. It's the one place where you can be directly in someone's head, and as I keep making this point, you are directly in their head, and it is really important. It's a really personal, intimate experience, and people will feel shortchanged and disappointed if you change the length without warning them about what's happening, because that may put them off their routine, and humans, as we know, are creatures of routine.
I think a really nice segue into a few other questions there as well in that case. Just specifically what you said there, Dave, about that idea of like building and engaging audiences. And we've had a few questions really about how to kind of to build engagement, to build community around a podcast. I mean, to put it bluntly, I guess, to market it as well. but also then how you encourage people to kind of delve back in to what already exists. So if you've got a podcast that someone discovers, how do you encourage them to go back to episode 1 rather than just what hits the top of the feed in their kind of podcast app? So yeah, some questions there for both of you about building audience, building community, but also how do you encourage people to get back in and dive into the wealth of stuff that you've produced at the same time? I guess the stuff you had the tip from Alex Churchill about no one's going to listen for a long time. You want to get that listened to eventually. So how do we get back in there?
Yeah. Loads. I think about this a lot. So let me just think about a few things, and then Bob can jump in, and maybe I'll think up something afterwards as well. Ratings and reviews are really, really helpful for driving yourself up the algorithm. So make sure you say in your podcast, please rate and review if you like this. If you get lots of 5-star reviews and people saying this is a great podcast, the algorithms like that, and you will find yourself being pushed up. It's really a really annoying thing, but it is true. Also, as I said, make sure you've got a really good title for your podcast, something that sounds interesting and exciting. Get the artwork right and get the description right, and get some really good keywords. If it's about royal history, make sure you mention royal history, kings and queens, Victoria, Tudors in the description, so that it picks up on the meta searches. It's search engine stuff. If you are recording podcasts, and quite a lot of podcast recording platforms allow you to record videos. I'm sure there's a few video questions. We haven't talked about that, but maybe we'll come back to that. Quite often you get the video recording as well. It's really easy to get a little clip out of it. So if someone says something interesting, you can make a little clip and you can use that on your social media channels and have someone saying, if someone says something particularly fascinating in 10, 15 seconds, those are the most, social media loves video. You're getting really good video clips, and that will be really engaging and hopefully will drive some people to want to come along. You can do swaps with other podcasts. If you know other people who are making podcasts, you can kind of do little trailer swaps and things and get yourself known about from other podcasts which have got some traffic. Bob, I'm running out of steam. Have you got anything else to add? I'm sure there's some things.
I'm just while you're thinking, I'd say that I was really lucky with Killing Victoria in that I wasn't having to promote something on my own from scratch. It kind of had the might of the BBC behind it. So like at one point it was advertised after Richard Osman's House of Games on BBC Two, and I was like lost my mind sort of seeing that on the telly. I think if I tried to do the exact same project on my own, and even if it sounded exactly the same, it would have been very difficult for it to have had the success it did, because I'd be starting from scratch. I think once people found it, if it's no good, they won't listen to it. So you've still got it. It still had to be all right. But getting that first click, I've definitely had a leg up with this project on that. I think I'd have to be honest with that. So I think, a 7-episode one-off series, if you're doing it on your own, that is not much time to build momentum. So if I was doing a project myself, I'd be thinking, what is a repeatable format that I can just keep going and keep building, because otherwise, what momentum you build in 7 episodes evaporates pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key thing I forgot to mention on that is invite the listeners in. That is the beauty of podcasting. It is that community experience. Is not that I'm broadcasting at you. It's I'm talking to you and with you. So ask them to come in. Ask them, have you got any questions on this one? The most popular podcast that we do 6 episodes a week, and we have sort of strands within strands. So most of them are one-to-one interviews, but on the weekend we do a user-generated podcast. Everything you want to know, we call it, where we just get a big name historian to answer questions from listeners derived from social media on a big topic. So on the Black Death, whatever. And those are perennially the most popular episodes, because people love to be able to get in there, and we make sure we name the people who've asked the questions, even if they've got ridiculous social media handles. We always say, Gilly Smith 46 on Twitter says ask this question, because people love to be name checked. And I think it's really important to invite your audience in. You don't need to do Q&A formats like that. There are other ways to do it, but ask them to come in and be part of the process. And that is the thing that podcast does that other media don't have such access to.
That's great. And actually, just about that idea of bringing people in, and a couple of questions about accessibility, about different formats. Are there things that people can be doing? Becky Mail asks, are there things people can be doing about embedding accessibility in the podcast? Things like transcripts and so on. There's a couple of questions also about video podcasts. Is that something, you mentioned it there, Dave? Is it something people should focus on as a kind of a twofer, effectively, or should you be focusing mostly on the audio and go one thing, well first? Or, what do you think about different platforms, different types of accessibility? How do you invite that audience in that way?
Transcripts, yes, if you can do them. I mean, there's lots of tools now that churn out transcripts, and Apple has just launched kind of a transcript function on their podcast players, I think, which will enable it to be really smooth and slick. So yeah, definitely. Video is a really difficult subject for podcasts. As Bob said in the intro, a podcast is by definition an audio thing, but now suddenly it's also a video thing, and there are loads of podcasts which have become video outlets, and lots of people do seem to want to watch videos of people doing podcasts. It is a really complicated thing to get right, because when you're editing a podcast, you are editing for the audio and making, and then it doesn't matter what's happening in the background. If you're editing in video and you clip out stuff, then you get a really jaggedy video, which you then need to work out how you can do it. So you have to start getting clever with video editing software and learn how to be a video editor. And there's lots of, that again, like audio editing, has been democratized with new tools, but nevertheless, it still requires a lot more work. You need to start getting B-roll, i.e. still footage, to drop on top of where the cut is to hide the gap, which means that suddenly the amount of time you're spending doing that video will be exponentially increased, and suddenly it becomes a bit untenable. That said, a lot of people do listen and watch podcasts on YouTube. It is a valuable place where do it. It's a place for visibility, going back to the previous conversation. So it's like for searchability, it's really handy to be on YouTube. You can just do it as kind of a waveform, like and just kind of put on stills and stuff. Though to make a slideshow video is extremely time consuming. So that's hard work. But just a still like a waveform with one still behind it is kind of one way to do it. It's not really a video per se, but it allows you to play on those platforms. But yeah, it is very time consuming to do that. I think one interesting way to do it is to take out the clips, which you can use for social, or and maybe even editorialize them around in a bit. So quite often I will make a video where I've spoken to somebody and they've said some interesting things, and then I can record a little bit after the fact and say, well, I've just spoken to Dr. Bob Nicholson. He told me all about Victorian jokes. I particularly like this bit where he told me a terrible joke about geese, and then I could clip in a bit of Bob telling me the joke about geese, and then then I can offer some further reflection. So it's kind of editorialized, not just a straight video. And those sorts of ways to do it, I think, are quite clever. And then you can have a little thing saying, for the full podcast, go to Apple or wherever.
That's great, thank you. So I've got one very quick question and then one maybe broader one. The first quick one is, I've got a few questions about money, about finances. Firstly, in terms of podcasts, do people get paid to be guests on podcasts? Should they expect to be paid? Somebody asking, is it still possible to earn a salary from podcasting, and what's likely there? And someone else asking, if they are, say, an academic, Bob, looking to make a program like Killing Victoria, let's say same setup, what should they be bidding for from a grant organization to do that? And that's the kind of the shorter question, because you'll be able to kind of like have a little stab at that in terms of a number. I'll let you kind of have a think for a second. And then the question I'd like to come on to, if that's all right, is we had a few people asking about getting started. If they are a doctoral student, if they are an early career researcher, if it's somebody just getting started who's interested in history and passionate about the idea of getting their stories out to an audience, what tips would you have for finding that story and for getting that story out there from the ground up? So over to you guys.
Okay. Thinking about the fun, I mean, I'm happy to say how much I was paid to make it. I mean, I don't know the full payroll of everybody involved in Killing Victoria. I think, given there was a producer working on it full time for 6 months, who's quite a senior producer, and multiple other figures, that would have been expensive, and more expensive than you would technically need. Look, as a contributor to it, I was paid £600 an episode for Killing Victoria, which, given the amount of time I put into it, I think was probably massively underpaying me. If I was doing that as a full-time job, effectively I earned between £4,000 and £5,000 for making it for on and off 6 months' work. So that would not have been a way to keep a roof over my head if I didn't have an academic job at the same time. The BBC, who I love a lot, does not pay an enormous amount for academic contributors, but it does pay a bit. So if I'm a guest on other podcasts, I mean, yeah, if it's a commercial podcast, I would expect to be paid a fee to be a guest on a podcast, and it might be £100, £200, depending on how much time. Like I would generally, I mean, everybody's different on this, and maybe I'm undervaluing myself, but I would normally say for a day's work for an external commercial company, I'd be looking at between £200 and £300. You know, it's what I pay an electrician to do a day's work in my house. I feel like it's a sort of fair rate to pay me. Maybe I should be charging more. I don't know. Maybe I'm going to learn now that I've been massively under negotiating. But yeah, if it's a more like if it's another academic making something, I would not expect to be paid for that, unless they're making a fortune from it themselves. So it would depend for me on the project. For that question about if you're bidding for money to make something. Yeah, you're going to have to think how long is it going to take to make it, and how many of those roles do you need to be filled by different people? I think you could conceivably hire a freelance podcast producer who would do most of the work that we did in Killing Victoria, where you as an academic would be maybe the researcher and perhaps presenter, depending on how you want to do it. But yeah, you would be looking. We're not talking about £4,000 or £5,000 to make the whole thing here. It would be a good deal more. I don't know, Dave. I don't know how much you're allowed to talk about money sides of things, but what do you reckon?
I can talk about most of it. So our approach is if someone, quite often we have people on the podcast who are talking about a book that they've just published. And if it's a commercial book, then I tend to take the view that we are providing a platform for them to talk about that book, and we will make sure that they get a good opportunity to plug it, and we will plug it start and finish of the podcast. And in that case, that feels to me like a good value exchange. And so we wouldn't offer payment for those conversations. When we are talking to somebody and we've asked them to do something, which is, ask them to do something above and beyond that, ask them to do some specific thinking about something, then yes, we will pay. And it depends on the task in hand. We don't have set rates for things because it kind of depends on how much we think we're asking someone to do. But I think certainly as commercial podcasts, yeah, that seems like a fair thing to do. But I think for most podcasts will not be in any way commercial, and I don't know how they would afford to pay guests in that case. Just thinking about sort of podcast monetization. How can you make money out of podcasts? So we have adverts on our podcasts. Spotify, we've kind of got a relationship with Spotify, and they sort of sell ads into it, and that provides some money but you need to be like a decent scale to be able to get advertising into it on sort of the it's called programmatic advertising. So it's just like people just selling ads in on a just selling ads into any audio environment. You can make money if you don't have a massive scale, but you have an interesting topic and an engaged listenership. Then you might be able to go out to an advertising partner, somebody who wants to be associated with that topic, even though they know that you haven't got a huge listenership, and they may say, "Well, we will sponsor you because we want to be part of this community that you've got here." So that is certainly possible. So you don't need to have millions of listeners to be able to get money from sponsors, but you need to identify who might want to be associated with it, and obviously you would need to be happy to be associated with those people. And then the other thing is, you can also, a lot of people who are doing podcasting are making will have like a paid for element. So you can get access to the History Extra podcast ad free on Apple. Apple have like a premium podcast thing, and also on our website you can subscribe and you can get them ad free. And people would have Patreons and things like that to provide for that. So building up that community element, a lot of people who are working on podcasts, and that way they'll have newsletters and things like other added inducements to make it feel like it's worth being part of a community. And I think that's probably one way to do it. Can you get a job in podcasting was another question. Yeah, absolutely can. We've got two people whose job titles are podcast editor who we're able to fund through the ad money we get. So yeah, you definitely can. And there's loads of companies that do that. Can you be a historian making podcasts and making money? Yeah, but you'll have to be a pretty successful one to make it your day job. I would have thought.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I would add on that is you may get, if a podcast does well, even if you don't earn money directly from the podcast itself, you may then get some income from things that result from it. So I'm currently writing the book version of Killing Victoria, and yeah, I will earn more from that than I did from the podcast.
Perfect, thank you. And just a final question for you both that we just mentioned there. Your top tip for somebody just starting out. What would you have? Just a top tip for somebody wanting to get started, a doctoral student, an early career researcher who wants to get involved in the world of podcasting.
Oh, crikey. Well, have a go. I mean, absolutely. I mean, that is the beauty of podcasting, is you can just have a go. Buy yourself a 20 quid YouTube mic and start recording. Listen to it and have a crack at it before you release it into the wild. But that, you will learn so much by just having a go. Get your friends to sit with you and either do, think about the formats I proposed at the start, see which one of them works best for you. You could go all in and try to create a scripted series. Find somebody who knows how to do audio and have a crack at it. It is that easy. It is that possible to do it. You don't need to get somebody else like me to say, yes, I come and do it. Gone are those days. You can just do it, get out on the airwaves, and start to build a social media presence. So do it would be my tip. It's not a very good tip, but that's my tip.
That would have been mine as well. I think just start experimenting. The barrier to entry is so low. And there's no pressure. If you're just making it for yourself, then you can take all the time you want. You can tinker with it. You can play around, and then eventually put it out. It's a very sort of low pressure thing. If you're not buying, if you're not investing an enormous sum of money or saying it's part of an enormous project, you're just going to have a go. So why not have a go at making a 15-minute podcast clip based on your research and just experiment with it? Think, if I've got 15 minutes to play with, what would I do with it? And have a go at telling a story with that, and just learn how to use an editor. Experiment with different mic techniques, and you don't even have to put it out, but just having a go at it and practically doing it rather than thinking too much about, what's it all going to be. Just get your hands dirty, just do it. It's a great way to actually find out what you're capable of doing.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to you both. That's been a fascinating discussion. I know I, for one, have really enjoyed hearing those tips from you guys. We've had some fantastic questions come in from our audience as well. And thank you very much for making the time to answer those. Hugely valuable, I think, giving people an insight into it. So yeah, thank you very kindly. Just before we close, loath as I am to bring us to a close, before we do, just wanted to say a quick word about the Royal Historical Society's next in-person event. This will be a lecture given by Professor Julia Late, which is taking place on Friday, 3rd of May at 6 p.m. Julia Late joined Birkbeck in 2010, and her current work examines critical family history, settler colonialism, and migration. Her lecture is entitled Possible Maps, Ways of Knowing and Unknowing at the Edge of Empire, which is based in Newfoundland in the kind of tail end of the 18th century. It's an in-person lecture at Mary Ward House, and it will also be live streamed on Zoom, so you can join us there. All of our recordings get made available, so please do look out for that. I saw a few questions coming in about that. We will make this available for you to view. But if you can't attend that event and you want to watch it at the time, please keep an eye on our website, as we're doing a great many other things that you can be involved in there. So with that, I'll close this event. Thank you very much to everyone, to Dave and to Bob and to everyone in the audience today. Thanks for joining us, and do enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are. Thank you very much. Cheers.